and welcome back to the Oopalip Cafe here in the third segment on our January the 14th, 2013 show. In this segment, we actually have a really good story, feel-good story kind of, that actually comes from the UK and involves a lot of other countries. You don't usually have a feel-good story that involves a lot of countries, but this one is kind of interesting. It comes to us via Fox News, but there have been several different news services reporting on it. Excavators are headed to Burma hoping to uncover a buried stash of World War II fighter planes. An airplane-obsessed farmer, a freelance archaeologist, and a team of excavators are heading to the Burma city of Yangon on Saturday to find a nearly forgotten stash of British fighter planes thought to be carefully buried beneath the former capital's airfield. The venture, backed with $1 million guarantee from a Belarusian video game company, could uncover dozens of Spitfire aircraft locked underground by American engineers at the end of World War II. We could easily double the number of Spitfires that are still known to exist, said 83-year-old David Cundall, C-U-N-D-A-L-L, the farmer and private pilot who has spent nearly 2 decades pursuing the theory that a batch of the famous fighter planes was buried in pristine condition in wooden crates in a riverbed at the end of an airport runway. In the Spitfire world, it would be similar to finding Tutankhamun's tomb, he told reporters Friday, ahead of his flight. Not everyone is as convinced, however. Even at the conference, freelance archaeologist Andy Brockman acknowledged that it was entirely possible that all the team would find was a mass of corroded metal and rusty aircraft parts, if it found anything at all. But Cundall said that eyewitness testimony from British and American veterans, as well as elderly local residents of Burma, coupled with survey data, aerial pictures, and ground radar soundings, left him in no doubt that the planes were down there. And others not involved in the trip have expressed cautious optimism. Quote, "There is a high percentage chance that something is buried there," unquote, said Charles Heyman, who edits the reference book, The Armed Forces of the United Kingdom. Heyman said it wasn't unusual for British forces to leave behind high-grade equipment in former war zones, even in recent conflicts, such as Iraq and Afghanistan. The Spitfire remains the UK's most famous combat aircraft, its reputation cemented by the Battle of Britain, when the fast-moving, sleek-looking, single-seater aircraft helped beat back waves of German bombers. Britain built a total of some 20,000 Spitfires, although the dawn of the jet age at the end of World War II meant that the propeller-driven planes quickly became obsolete. Many were written off as the British war effort wound down. But why a batch of Spitfires would have been boxed and buried, as opposed to scrapped and dumped, remains the biggest question hanging over the project. Cundall, who has long scoured crash sites to recover buried aircraft, said he first heard of the Burma theory from a fellow plane hunter named Jim Pierce, who was at a party in Jacksonville, Florida, when 2 American veterans approached him with an unusual story. The men said that they had worked as engineers in what was then known as Burma, when they were tasked with carving out a large burial pit, apparently, for the aircraft. "It was the craziest thing you Brits ever asked us to do," Cundall quoted the men as saying. Cundall said he believed the story immediately. Advertisements seeking more information were placed in magazines with names like Fly Past and Warbirds, and soon other witnesses came forward. One, a British veteran named Stanley Combe, described driving along the airfield's perimeter while engineers lowered huge wooden boxes described as the size of double-decker buses into a pit. Radar soundings appeared to show large, plane-sized objects lurking roughly 25 feet below the surface, Cundall said. But finding the site was just half the battle. Cundall said it took 17 years of lobbying to get permission to dig in Burma, a task complicated by European sanctions against the country's authoritarian government, and more recently, its tentative steps towards democracy. Kundal beat out other groups in an effort to win exclusive rights to the dig, finally signing an agreement in early October. Along the way, he found an unlikely ally, a Belarusian company called Wargaming.net, best known for its multiplayer titles including World of Warplanes and World of Tanks. The company's American Director of Special Projects, Tracy Spate, said he got his company involved after hearing about the Spitfires in the news, promising $500,000 towards the dig and up to another $500,000 if the Spitfires are found. Company spokesman Fraser Nash batted away repeated questions about the video game maker in the country known as Europe's last dictatorship hoped to get out of the deal, saying the company had an open bucket to dispense cash if the dig was a success. Money's not an issue, he told journalists. Have you seen the profits for gaming? The reporters seemed mollified. Can I have a job? One asked. The Spitfires, if any are ever found, would be divided between the Burmese government in line for about half the total, a local company which would get another 20%, and Kundal, who would get roughly a third. The Burma government might decide to sell its planes, Kundal said, although he promised that his share would be coming back to the UK where they belong. He said, "It was a tool of war, but I want to make it a tool of friendship to bring Burma and Britain closer together. Also," he said, "I would love to fly one." After a last round of television interviews at the hotel Friday, Kundal slipped a jacket over his black Wargaming.net t-shirt, rubbed his hands together against the cold, casting his mind to his upcoming trip and the moment of truth. Only a matter of time now before we start digging and find out what's in the box, he said. So yeah, kind of a feel-good story with 4 different countries actually involved, including the U.S., with the U.S. division of Wargaming.net, and of course Belarus, Britain, and Burma. Now this is a little bit reminiscent of another case of buried airplanes that were recovered. And one of the things that they referred to in this story was they may not find anything that's worth salvaging. In Greenland, back several years ago, 20 years ago or so, there was a P-38 carved out of the ice of Greenland. Now, it had gone down during severe weather while being ferry flighted to the European theater. I was lucky enough to get acquainted with one of the people involved in that recovery. And he was also involved in the restoration. And that plane, although it's not flown much, it is capable of flight today, to the best of my belief. It was fully restored. A lot of things were bad when they actually recovered it. So that's kind of what Mr. Kundal's alluding to with not knowing what they'll find, as well as the archaeologist. They don't know what they'll find. It could just be a bunch of rust and junk. But nevertheless, it would answer the question. So there are folks who spend a great deal of time, money, and effort to recover these vintage aircraft with no guarantee that they'll ever actually have anything when they're done. I have to admire their grit, if nothing else. On the other hand, I have to wonder exactly what the Belarusian Wargame.net company has in mind for their share. Could be that they, oh well, I won't even speculate. I don't think they'll be flying them themselves. Although, according to the people I've talked to, that is a dream airplane as far as your ability to fly it. Almost anyone with any amount of flight training can operate it. Maybe not the same way they did when they were chasing buzz bombs, but perhaps I can get some photographs or clips of that because it's an amazing thing. Anyway, Belarus, Burma, UK, and US all working together to find out what's in the box. Kind of a cool story, I think. And now back to our Pompeii story for just a few more minutes. This article comes from Live Science, and it's actually involves a number of overseas universities and researchers, most notably Maria Vientanen from the University of Helsinki. And it is entitled Pompeii Wall Posts Reveal Ancient Social Networks. It's written by Stephanie Pappas, Life Science senior writer, and dated January the 10th. Think of it as the earliest version of the Facebook wall post. Ancient Pompeii residents revealed their social networks through graffiti on actual walls. Now, a new analysis of some of these scribbled messages reveals the walls of the wealthy were highly sought after, especially for political candidates hoping to drum up votes. The findings suggest that Pompeii homeowners may have had some control over who got artistic on their walls, said study researcher Eva Maria Vientanen, I think, an archaeologist at the University of Helsinki. The current view is that any candidate could have chosen any location and had their ad painted on the wall. But after looking at the context, this would seem very unlikely, she told Live Science. The facades of the private houses and even the street walks in front of them were controlled and maintained by the owner of the house. And in that respect, the idea that the wall space could be appropriated by anyone who wanted to do it seems rather unlikely. Pompeii, which was famously destroyed and frozen in time by an eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, was a city of avid scribblers. She told Live Science, people scratched messages into the city's stucco walls or wrote them in charcoal. They copied literary quotes, wrote greetings to friends, and made notes of sums. Amid all these amateur wall posts were political campaign ads, most of which were done by professional painters. It was these spots that she and her colleagues focused on, mapping out each message and noting its context. The researchers wanted to know where candidates put their messages, whether it was near bars or other high traffic areas or on the walls of private houses. And where did certain candidates focus their campaigns? To narrow down the enormous amount of graffiti, the researchers focused on 3 regions of the city, 2 residential areas on opposite sides of town, and 1 business district. There were more than 1,000 electoral messages scrawled on the walls in these regions, most dating from the last 3 centuries of Pompeii's existence. Most of the messages were simple, containing just a name and the office the person was running for. Sometimes there are some simple attributes, such as a good man, worthy of public office, she said. One candidate even bragged about his bread baking abilities on his campaign wall post. Other ads were sponsored by groups supporting a particular candidate, including such unsavory fraternities as pickpockets, late-night drinkers, and petty thieves. Makes you wonder whether their candidates were really worth voting for. The first find was that politicians wanted an audience. The campaign ads were almost invariably on heavily trafficked streets. This was reported at the annual meeting of the Archaeological Institute of America in Seattle, which was January the 4th, incidentally. The second most surprising discovery was that the most popular spots for ads were private houses rather than bars or shops that would see a lot of visitors. Bars were probably more populated, but could their customers read and would they vote? Some 40% of the ads were on prestigious houses, she said, which is notable because there were only 1/3 as many lavish homes as there were bars, shops, and more modest residences. Clearly, candidates were vying for space on the homes of the wealthy. That discovery makes Vientanen and her colleagues think that the ads really reveal early social networking. It seems likely that candidates would need permission from the homeowner to paint their ad, suggesting that graffiti is something of an endorsement. The research is preliminary and not yet published in a peer-reviewed journal. And Vientanen said there is much more work to do to map the social networks revealed on the ancient walls. So far, we have barely scratched the surface on this. There are hundreds of texts and locations, and it takes a lot of time to go through them all. Well, I'll bet it does. But Pompeii was frozen in time in 79 AD by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Below Pompeii was the basically slave town of Herculaneum. And it is amazing that it was also preserved at about the same situation context as was Pompeii, and yet the lifestyles were vastly different. And it was something of a revelation to archaeologists back 30 years ago or so when they found a particular skeleton, a young girl aged estimated 12 years of age. She was wearing some jewelry, so they thought, how could she be a slave if she had all this fairly nice jewelry? And yet her skeletal remains indicated that she had worked hard. So the speculation, informed speculation admittedly, but still speculation, was that she was a house slave who was also a nanny to younger children and ended up bearing those children in her arms, which is why she had biceps. She's a strong girl. Anyway, we'll be back with more after these messages here on the Oopaloopa Cafe.